And many aid organizations are calling for a corridor to be opened through the Strait of Hormuz. They warned that the ongoing U.S. naval blockade on the waterway is preventing crucial aid supplies from getting to millions of people in need. One of those organizations raising the alarm is the International Rescue Committee, and I'm joined now by Ciarán Donnelly. He is the Senior Vice President of International Programs at the International Rescue Committee. He joins us now from New York. Thank you for making time for us.
Thanks, Artie. Good to be here.
First, I'm hoping that you can outline for us what the situation is like right now. Just how critical is it to get a humanitarian corridor?
It's increasingly imperative that we find a way to get humanitarian and commercial supplies moving in order to mitigate widespread impact of this regional crisis in the Middle East on humanitarian crises elsewhere in the world. Of course, the very first impact of this is on civilians in Iran and in Lebanon and in neighboring countries who are suffering from the very direct impact of airstrikes and missiles and so on. But in countries around the world, the IRC works in over 35 humanitarian crises around the world. About half of those are in Africa. We're seeing a direct impact of the regional crisis in the Middle East on our ability to deliver critical humanitarian services in those places. Costs are skyrocketing. Some of our teams are reporting that operational costs have increased by over 50% and that critical supplies are in short order because of supply chain blockages, because of fuel blockages, and so on, arising from the crisis in the Middle East. And so in a world in which 30% of humanitarian funding was reduced last year, aid agencies are already struggling to save lives and keep people alive in crisis zones in places like Sudan, in places like Yemen, places like Chad, and we're under even more strain now than we have been previously.
Is there any sort of contingency plan or plan B that is in place right now in order to try to work around this, given that there's no news as we have it right now on whether or not this blockade, this war is going to end anytime soon?
There's nothing concrete in sight that I'm aware of. Obviously, the best solution, both for civilians under fire and for aid operations around the world, would be a stable and durable ceasefire that allows for a resumption of production and commercial, especially maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Absent that, we've said that we need to see a humanitarian corridor. Now, there is a high-level political initiative sponsored by the UN Secretary General, which is very welcome, modeled somewhat on the Black Sea Grain Initiative that enabled Ukrainian wheat exports to flow during the early years of the Ukraine war. There's some important material, logistical and political differences in this context, and as yet, there's no sign of that humanitarian corridor being opened up. And as I said, this is becoming increasingly desperate. Our budgets are constrained, they're not infinitely elastic, and every increase in price ultimately results in less services being available for people who desperately need them.
Less services, less supplies. Let's talk about some of the specifics. We know the World Food Program has said millions more people could face hunger because of these disruptions that are linked, of course, to this ongoing conflict. So how quickly could this turn then into a wider regional humanitarian emergency? We're talking specifically about a hunger crisis that, has been sort of on again, off again in some parts of the world.
Yeah, we started 2026 with 37 million people around the world living in emergency levels of food insecurity. UN figures released just earlier this week confirm what we've suspected, that those numbers are increasing, and we are seeing a direct impact of the Middle East conflict as a contributor to that. 30% approximately of global fertilizer supplies come through the Strait of Hormuz in normal times. Because of constraints in the availability of fertilizer, with planting seasons coming up in critical countries in East Africa that produce food not just for themselves but for the wider region, we're anticipating that we will see lower crop yields down the road from those harvests. And that's only going to push up prices, with the hardest hit being those people who already struggle to put food on their table. We're also seeing an impact on our ability to deal with the most acutely malnourished children. Some of our supplies of what we call ready-to-use therapeutic food, those are specialized feeding products that keep children alive when they're acutely malnourished. some of those supplies have been stuck in Dubai and other ports around the world, meaning that our operations in countries like Chad and Sudan and Yemen are increasingly strained in being able to keep those children alive. 25 billion has been estimated to having been spent on this conflict to date. That's more than enough to treat every one of the 43 million acutely malnourished kids in the world 5 times over, which is a staggering statistic and underscores just quite what's at stake as this conflict continues.
Ciarán, finally, I wanted to ask you, I know that many of your colleagues, of course, are on the ground in some of these regions that are deeply impacted by the ongoing conflict. What are they telling you?
We have a large team in Lebanon. We have a long-term program there which has been supporting both Syrian refugees. There's around 1 million Syrians who still live in Lebanon from the conflict there, but also over the last number of years supporting Lebanese who've been affected by the 2024 conflict, as well as currently we've mounted a large-scale emergency response. We're seeing that even though people are starting to return home with some reduction in violence, airstrikes and conflict still continues. Civilians are still in the firing line in Lebanon, and humanitarian needs remain largely unmet despite the efforts of the government and humanitarian community. There's real anxiety elsewhere in the region that as this conflict continues, there's going to be further escalation of other crises, increasing humanitarian need and driving instability in a region that has seen far too much of both over the last number of years.
Ciarán, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for your time. That is Ciarán Donnelly. He is the Senior Vice President of International Programs at the IRC. He joined us from New York today. Thanks again.
Thank you.